The winter storm had rolled into the small Montana town with a fury no one had expected. Winds roared like angry wolves across the barren fields, flinging snow in thick sheets that swallowed up the roads, fences, and even the outlines of the trees. The townsfolk had retreated early into their homes, curtains drawn tight and fires stoked high, but out on the edge of town, in a weathered farmhouse that had stood for nearly a century, Mrs. Agnes Parker moved about her kitchen with quiet purpose. At 72, she was small and slightly stooped, but her blue eyes still held the spark of a woman who had weathered more storms than she could count. She had lit the old wood-burning stove, hung a kettle of water above the flame, and laid out bread with a jar of preserves for her simple supper. Her late husband, Henry, used to joke that she could survive the end of the world with nothing but her pantry and her kindness, and tonight, as the blizzard raged outside, she thought of him fondly. She was alone now, her children scattered in distant cities, but she refused to leave the home she and Henry had built together. As she settled into her rocking chair, she suddenly heard it, the low, unmistakable rumble of engines carried faintly through the howling wind. At first, she thought it must be her imagination. Who would be out in such weather? But then, louder, closer, the sound came again. Curiosity stirred in her chest, she pulled on her wool shawl and opened the door. The storm slapped her face with icy force, yet through the white blur of falling snow, dark figures emerged, their silhouettes cutting against the drift. One by one, motorcycles sputtered into her driveway, headlights glowing like ghostly orbs. 15 in total, each carrying a man clad in leather jackets and heavy boots, their clothes crusted with snow, their beards and hair stiff with frost. The patches on their backs were clear even through the storm, Hell's Angels. Agnes' heart gave a nervous jump, for she, like most, had heard stories of these men, wild, dangerous, living outside the law. But as they dismounted, stomping their frozen feet, she noticed their shivering hands, the weariness in their eyes, and the way they glanced uncertainly at her small, warm-lit house. The leader, a tall man with a scar running from his cheek to his jaw, stepped forward and lifted his chin. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough but respectful, "we don't mean trouble. The roads are blocked, and we've got nowhere to go. Could we shelter in your barn for the night?" Snowflakes clung to his lashes, and his breath hung thick in the air. Agnes, standing in her doorway, studied him for a long moment. Fear should have driven her to shut the door, to call the sheriff, to keep to herself as most would. But her heart, softened by years of giving, told her otherwise. "You'll catch your deaths out there," she said firmly, opening the door wider. "Get inside. All of you. The barn won't do. It's colder than the devil's heart tonight. Come in before you freeze." Surprised glances passed between the bikers, but one by one, they obeyed, ducking their heads as they entered her humble farmhouse, bringing with them the sharp scent of leather and snow. And just like that, in the middle of a stormy night, the lives of a kind old lady and 15 outlaw bikers collided under the same roof. Inside the little farmhouse, the warmth from the crackling stove quickly began to melt the frost from the bikers' heavy jackets and boots. Water dripped onto the wooden floorboards, and steam curled up from their gloves as they stretched their hands toward the fire. At first, they looked awkward, 15 large, rough-looking men in leather squeezed into a space that seemed far too small for them, shifting uncomfortably as though afraid they might break something. Agnes, however, wasted no time fussing over them. Sit down," she urged, bustling around the kitchen like a mother hen with a brood of oversized chicks. She ladled out hot soup into mismatched bowls, set bread on the table, and even poured mugs of tea, her frail hands moving with surprising energy. The men exchanged glances, clearly unused to such unassuming generosity. They were used to suspicion, to doors slammed in their faces, to townsfolk who crossed the street to avoid them. Yet here was this frail old lady, treating them not as outlaws, but as guests. As the hours passed, the walls of tension slowly crumbled. One biker with a shaved head and tattooed arms noticed the leg of a kitchen chair wobbling dangerously and, without being asked, knelt to fix it with his pocket knife and a length of twine. Another carried in wood from the porch, stacking it neatly by the stove. A younger one, barely more than a boy, cleared the table after the meal, clumsily drying dishes while Agnes washed. She chuckled softly at his efforts, her laughter filling the room with warmth far richer than the fire could give. Slowly, conversation began. They asked about her farm, her late husband, her children who lived far away. She answered with stories that carried both sorrow and pride, and in return, they shared tales of endless highways, broken engines, and the brotherhood they called family. The scarred leader, who introduced himself simply as Jack, sat closest to the fire, listening more than he spoke. Eventually, he admitted that it had been years since someone outside their circle had treated them kindly. His voice carried a hint of something softer beneath the roughness, and for a brief moment, Agnes glimpsed not an outlaw, but a man burdened by the world's judgments. "You remind me of Henry," she told him gently, speaking of her late husband who had once ridden a motorcycle, his eyes full of the same restless wanderlust. That confession seemed to bridge an invisible gap, and Jack nodded with a quiet respect. By midnight, the storm outside still howled, but inside the little farmhouse, the atmosphere was entirely different. Laughter burst forth as one biker attempted to strum a half-broken guitar Agnes kept by the fireplace, singing in a gravelly voice that made the others roar with amusement. They spread their blankets across the floor, their massive frames huddled together like schoolboys at a sleepover, while Agnes sat in her rocker, knitting and smiling at the unlikely scene. Before drifting to sleep, Jack spoke softly, almost like a promise carried by the wind, "You've given us more than shelter tonight, ma'am. We won't forget this." Agnes waved her hand dismissively, her eyes twinkling as she whispered back, "Nonsense. You needed help, and I had it to give. That's all." Yet deep down, neither of them knew just how far that one act of kindness would ripple. Morning came slowly, the storm finally breaking into a still and dazzling silence. The snow had piled high around the farmhouse, glittering in the pale sunlight like crushed diamonds. Agnes awoke to the sound of muffled voices and the scrape of shovels outside. When she peeked through her frost-touched window, she was astonished to see the bikers hard at work. Some were clearing her walkway and driveway, while others repaired the sagging fence along her property line. A few hauled armfuls of firewood into her shed, stacking it with such precision that it stood taller than she had ever managed herself. For men who had been strangers only hours before, they moved as though they had known her for years, each task carried out with quiet determination. Agnes wrapped herself in her shawl and stepped outside, her breath clouding in the crisp air. "You boys don't need to fuss over me," she called out, but Jack, the scarred leader, grinned from beneath his frost-dusted beard. "Mama, after what you did for us last night, this is the least we can do." The word "mama" startled her, but it warmed her heart in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. By noon, the men were ready to leave. Engines roared to life, the deep thunder echoing across the snowy fields. One by one, they mounted their bikes, their leather jackets glinting under the winter sun. Jack lingered a moment longer, walking up to her porch with a respectful nod. "We'll never forget you, Agnes. You showed us something the world rarely does. Don't be surprised if you see us again." She patted his arm gently, smiling as though speaking to her own son. "You're always welcome here," she replied, and with that, they rode off in a line of 15 bikes, their tracks carving deep lines into the snow. Agnes watched until they disappeared into the horizon, her heart full of an odd blend of peace and longing. The following day, the quiet of her farmhouse returned. She went about her chores, stirring stew on the stove and knitting by the fire, replaying the laughter and voices from the night before. She assumed it had been a once-in-a-lifetime encounter, an odd story she would tell her grandchildren, if they cared to listen. But just as the sun dipped low in the sky, a strange vibration began to tremble through the air. At first, it was faint, a low hum, but it grew louder, deeper, until her windows rattled in their panes. Agnes stepped onto her porch, clutching her shawl around her shoulders, and froze in shock. Down the long country road, one after another, motorcycles rolled into sight. Not 15 this time, but dozens, scores of them, until the horizon itself seemed filled with their rumble. She gasped as more and more came, leather jackets gleaming, headlights flashing in unison, their engines roaring like a chorus. When they finally slowed to a halt, she counted nearly 100 bikes lined up along her driveway and stretching far down the road. The air quivered with the power of their presence. Jack appeared again, climbing off his bike with a wide grin. "Told you we'd be back," he said, his voice carrying over the engines. Word got out. Everyone wanted to meet the woman who gave the angels a home in a storm. Behind him, dozens of men and women cheered, their voices echoing in the cold air. Agnes stood in stunned silence, her small farmhouse dwarfed by the sight of 100 roaring bikes lined up at her door. Agnes stood on her porch, still stunned by the sight before her, 100 bikes gleaming in the afternoon light, their riders standing tall in rows like soldiers paying respects. For a woman who had lived quietly for years, the sudden roar of leather and chrome at her doorstep felt surreal, almost like a dream. Yet when Jack approached, removing his helmet with a smile that softened his scarred features, the reality settled warmly in her chest. "Mama Agnes," he called her, loud enough for the others to hear. The name rippled through the crowd, and soon dozens of voices joined in, chanting affectionately, "Mama Agnes. Mama Agnes." Her eyes watered, not from the cold, but from the overwhelming wave of love and belonging washing over her. For so long, she had thought her best days were behind her, her husband gone, her children busy with their own lives, but now she found herself surrounded by a family larger and louder than she could ever have imagined. The bikers didn't just come to pay their respects, they came to give back. They unloaded crates of food from their trucks, sacks of grain for her chickens, firewood cut and split, even spare tools for her barn. Some of the women rode up with fresh groceries, blankets, and little handmade gifts. Agnes hardly knew where to look as her quiet yard transformed into a bustling gathering place, filled with laughter, clinking tools, and the scent of hot coffee one of the bikers brewed over an outdoor fire pit. Someone had even brought a cake, frosted with the words "Thank you, Mama Agnes," which made her laugh until tears spilled freely down her cheeks. Neighbors peeked nervously from afar, unsure of what to make of the spectacle, but Agnes didn't care what they thought. She knew the truth: beneath the tattoos, scars, and leather, these people had hearts as loyal as any she had ever known. From that day forward, Agnes' life blossomed with unexpected joy. The angels became regular visitors, their thundering engines no longer a sound that stirred fear in her neighbors but a signal that Mama Agnes was being looked after. When her roof needed patching, 10 men climbed up and fixed it in a day. When her old truck refused to start, one of the bikers had it running before nightfall. On holidays, they brought food, gifts, and laughter to her table, filling her little farmhouse with life and energy. On her 73rd birthday, more than 100 bikes rode through the streets of town in formation, each rider carrying flowers to lay at her gate. The spectacle left even the mayor speechless, and for Agnes, it was a moment of pure wonder. What began as one stormy night of shared soup and shelter became the beginning of something extraordinary, a bond that defied stereotypes and expectations. Agnes had given 15 stranded men a warm place to rest, never asking for anything in return. In doing so, she had unknowingly opened her heart to an entire brotherhood, who in turn gave her what she had been missing most, a family that never let her feel alone again. As she sat on her porch that evening, listening to the fading rumble of engines in the distance, Agnes smiled to herself and whispered, "Henry, you'd be proud. I've found my boys."